Welcome back to the game room. It is time to answer 23 questions for GMs. Because good things come in 23s, as the old saying goes, be they questions, penguins, or stabbings on the Senate floor, although Julius Caesar might disagree with that last one. Now these questions were created by Zak S of a different website, and they were posted to the community originally by Samwise7RPG, Tim H, and now I will answer these 23 questions. Alright, the first is, if you had to pick a single invention in a game you were most proud of, what would it be? What comes to mind is in my very first D&D 3.0 campaign. There was a player who wanted to be a dark elf sorcerer. And first, a little bit of backstory for this campaign. It was in a world that I created, imaginatively I named it Gaia. And in this world, the dark elves were not a separate race from high elves, nor were they necessarily evil. In ages past, there was an invasion from the planes into the prime material world, and the high elves gave up their elven immortality to seal these planar portals and protect Earth, Gaia, from extraplanar invasion. Such was the power of the immortality magic of the high elves. Now the dark elves were a splinter faction that said, hey, we didn't vote for that. Why'd you give up our immortality? So the dark elves are obsessed with becoming immortal. So in the ranks of the dark elves, there are liches and demi-liches and vampires and necromancers from hell to breakfast, because they are obsessed with living forever once more. So anyway, one of the characters he wanted to be, one of the players wanted a dark elf sorcerer character, and he gave me this character background that was he and a cabal of mages had experimented with magic and infused magic into his very blood. He wasn't a sorcerer who was descended from dragons. He was an experimentation and had the arcane essence flowing through his veins, and this is what gave him his sorcerer's powers. And during this experiment, they created him so that one day he might be a god slayer. One day he might enter the extraplanar realms and tear down the gods from the skies and take their magic, so that he can take whatever magic it was that the gods used to keep themselves immortal, because if this was a Planescape campaign, this character would very much be of the Aethar faction that believes that the gods and other such deities are really just powerful mages, and they have gotten that way by uncovering magical secrets. So his goal was to tear down these secrets and strip them from these beings, and he himself and the rest of the Dark Elves would once again become immortal by stealing this power. And he used to be a sorcerer of such immense power that the Celestials themselves descended from heaven and beat the hell out of him with their maces of disruption, sending him to a shattered heap. And from this beatdown, he lost his memories, and then he woke up on a slab one day, because at this time Planescape Torment was a new game, we all enjoyed it. So he woke up on a slab without his memories, and he had to once again regain his power and become the God Slayer once again. So I like this background, but it was very grandiose for a first level sorcerer, because that's where we're beginning the campaign at first level. So a GM needs to know when to say yes, they need to know when to say no, and you need to know when to say yes, but. And so I went for yes, but, as I often do. And what I did is the player and the character were sure that they were an amnesiac, and they woke up and they have these shards of memories of battles and events and magic that they seem to recall in this fog, but they don't quite understand where it came from. But unbeknownst to the character and the player was that he was not the sorcerer that he thought he was. He was not the sorcerer that was experimented upon to become this God Slayer. He was in fact a reject clone, because in 3rd edition, and maybe other editions, there's a spell in D&D called Clone, and what a wizard can do is set aside this spare body in a tube of stasis, And should the wizard be killed, oop, his soul goes pew and hops into the clone, effectively making him fairly immortal. If I remember in the Star Wars comic books, Emperor Palpatine sort of does the same thing. So when the Celestials came down and beat the sorcerer, his name's Velmon, by the way. When the Celestials beat Velmon into oblivion, he didn't die, but he was so close to death that his clone, his spare clone, awoke, and it had just this shard of his soul, just this shard of his power, and that's what made him a level 1 sorcerer. So essentially, and he had these false memories. So he actually had the memories of someone else. And so as he was adventuring through the lands, trying to jog his memory and trying to regain his power, he kept having these visions. He would be visited in his dreams by this cowled character, and he would whisper to him arcane secrets, and he would test his mettle, he would test his will in these dreams by forcing him to do these horrible things, and seeing whether or not he possessed the will to take power. Did he possess the will to become the God Slayer? And this was the original sorcerer, and he was sending out these visions so that he might find his clone, so that he might find this player character. And he was experimenting to see one of two things would happen: whether he would, whether this clone would be weighed and measured and found wanting, and he would just kill him, and then take that little shard of his soul back, that little smidgen of power, and take it back, because this Velmon, the original sorcerer, does not share power. Or would this clone become an interesting and useful pawn for him to send out there and do his bidding, his dirty work, whether his clone knows it or not? He was being manipulated, essentially, by his sire. And so that was a creation that I did for a character's background, and he was unaware until after the fact that he himself was a clone of another person. He thought he was the original sorcerer. Now, questions 2 and 3 are: when was the last time you GM'd, and when was the last time you played? I'll answer both at the same time with the same answer, and that is, it's been too long. I think unless you're in a weekly game, that's probably anyone's answer to that question, I think. Now, question 4. Give us a one-sentence pitch for an adventure you haven't run, but you would like to. As the U.S. mires through the Great Depression, the Hollywood Dream Factory keeps chugging along. But just who is this mysterious organization known as the Circle of Light, and why do they have their hooks seemingly in all media? So that's a one-sentence pitch for a Call of Cthulhu game that would take place in 1930s Hollywood, combining the dreamlike wonder of the Great Depression's cinema, because it was all musicals and it was escapist fantasy. So I would combine that and juxtapose it with the grim, dark horror of the Call of Cthulhu universe. So question 5. What do you do while you wait for players to do things? Well, if the players are going around in town and they're faffing about and they can't decide what shop to go to, or they can't decide which NPC to go visit, that's one of the few times when I'm actually waiting for the players to do something. You know, when I'm GMing, when anyone is GMing, since you're the referee for any and all actions in the game, you're often quite busy, because if someone wants to go visit this NPC, oh, you're role-playing that NPC. If someone wants to go here and go to the shop, well, you need to do some quick role-playing as the shopkeeper and show them the wares. So there's very few instances where I'm actually waiting for a player to do something, and in those rare instances I try and either eat or hydrate myself, because I've been talking all day. Now, if I'm waiting for characters to do something in combat, this is very important. Everyone should do this. If you're waiting for a character to make a decision in combat, combat is pow, 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 fast, fast. If you hesitate, your head falls off. So if someone is hesitating in combat, you go 3, 2, 1, and you count down. Maybe not that fast, but you count down, and it gives the player that sense of urgency, and they will make a decision. Otherwise, their turn is skipped as they hesitate during combat, and arrows fill them up. and they die. No. So, the next question, what, if anything, do you eat while you play? Well, I try and go for like, here and there snacking on maybe some pretzels or some pita chips dipped in hummus, or maybe some peanuts or whatever. I don't go for anything that has dust on it. I don't go for anything that leaves a residue, greasy, dusty, cheesy. I don't go for that. Now, lunch breaks and dinner breaks are typically the fare of going out and getting sandwiches, maybe getting pizza brought in, or my personal favorites, when we go and get either Indian food or Thai food. There will be curry, that's what I say. So, question 7. Do you find GMing physically exhausting? I really don't, because GMing, it's pretty simple. It's the closest I come to being physically exhausted is losing my voice a bit, because I try and make an all-day session, so it involves me talking all day, and I can lose my voice a bit from that because I'm not a big talker. Sometimes I'll go entire days without talking if there's no one around. So that's about as physically exhausting as GMing gets for me, because it's talking, it's taking notes, it's doing grand sweeping gestures as you explain something. It's like, oh, he blocks high with his shield and then thrusts low into your guts with his sword. Or, you enter the tavern and you see the buxom ogre courtesan. Just sweeping gestures like that. If you've wondered why I'm always making gestures during my videos, why do I talk with my hands, it is because I was bitten by a radioactive Italian and I gained his powers. So, question 8. What was the last interesting thing you remember a PC you were running doing? Now, this question's worded a bit strangely, and even though it's a question for a GM, I think it's when last you were a player, what was the most interesting thing you did? So what I did, I was a player most recently in a Westeros-based game using the Song and Ice of Fire role-playing system, the one by Green Ronin. So without going into too much backstory, so it'd take too long, my character was the bastard heir to a noble house in the north. And I say bastard heir because as being bastard born, he cannot actually inherit the title, but if he gains enough renown, if he gets legitimized by either the king or the warden of the north, he would become the heir. So that was his all-consuming, all-driving goal, to be the heir to the house, because he's the only son. He is actually the only child of this lord at the time. So driven, and he's a bastard, so his entire life people have been looking down upon him and treating him horribly. And so he's driven by this great ambition, he's driven by this great desire to be someone, and he's driven by this massive inferiority complex. And so anyway, our characters were on a long boat trip. And so, my character was in the hold, and what can you do on a boat except just get drunk constantly? And so my character was deep within his cups, and he brought the other characters around, and he spoke to them, and in his drunken stupor, he revealed his darkest and deepest secret. That when he was, the character at the time is 18, and when he was but 14, he had a younger brother, a true heir to the house was born. And thus, he was robbed of any potential of ever becoming this heir, because as a bastard, if there's any sort of true-born heir, he is out. There's no way that he can inherit the title, even though he is older by 14 years than this heir. And so he regales the party with this story of, again, when he was drunk, he stumbled into the nursery where his baby brother lay in his crib, and he looked down at this child. And he knew, just by the sheer act of being born, this innocent child stole everything from him. It stole his ambition, it stole his future, it stole his glory. Now the only recourse left to a bastard in the north was to join the Night's Watch and essentially exile himself in the north. And this did not sit well with him. And so he looked down, and his heart filled with darkness, and he drew a dagger. And he looked down, and he held this dagger aloft. It glittered in the moonlight coming through the window. He looked down at his half-brother, his own flesh and blood, and he knew there was only one way he could ever inherit the title to this house. He looked down, the dagger raised again, but he couldn't do it. He realized what he would become if he did any kinslaying, what a horrendous sin this would be. And so this character, whose all-consuming goal was to become the heir, he knew there were certain lines he could not cross. And he threw that dagger to the ground, and he left, and he resigned himself to joining the wall as an exiled Night's Watchman. Now, in fact, he didn't, because unfortunately, his little brother later, 4 years later, died of the plague, and he became, once again, the only potential for an heir to this house. And that is where the campaign began, and that is where my character had to go and make a name for himself in all the adventures through Westeros. So, that was question 8. Now, question 9. Do your players take your serious setting and make it unserious? Vice versa? Neither? I would say neither. I would also say if they do, it's not to any egregious manner. I haven't run like a comedic setting. I certainly have comedic things happen in a setting, even in something like World of Darkness, even in Vampire. Something funny can happen, and in fact you should. You should have something funny happen. World of Darkness, especially if you just have this cloying, heavy, crushing, just grim darkness all the time. Well, your mileage may vary, but I couldn't play a game like that for too long. There needs to be something, even if it's like pitch black gallows humor, like something needs to happen even in a vampire campaign that makes you laugh a bit. So if the players are getting, if I'm trying to do some sort of dramatic scene, and if the players are getting a bit too jovial about it, it's just a simple simple recourse being like, hey, let's calm down here, let's get serious, let's get right in this scene, and everything's fine. So if any sort of jokiness happens when it's not supposed to, it's not to an egregious manner, and it can just stop. So that's fine. Question 10, this is my jam. Now, what do you do with goblins? A better question is, man, what don't I do with goblins? I do everything with goblins. I do dirty things, things that are best kept in the darkness. No, not really. In the setting I created that I mentioned earlier of Gaia, I have 2 types of goblins. I have the Western goblins and the Eastern goblins. Now first, the Western goblins are your typical green guys. They have their long noses, green skin, and big pointy ears. And the setting of Gaia is, well, at the time it was unique. I need to stress that I created this world and I created these goblins before ever playing World of Warcraft or reading the Iron Kingdoms setting of RPGs, in which, anyway, so in Gaia it is a fantasy world, but through the use of magic, they're just starting to enter an industrial revolution powered by arcane energies and arcane crystals. So, these Western goblins, when they're in the wild, they're often beaten down and subjugated by orcs and ogres and such like that. In the cities, they are, at best, they are second-class citizens, and they're given these miserable jobs for almost no pay, and they're treated very poorly. The goblins were always my sort of Dickensian, Tiny Tim, sort of characters that are. I mean them to elicit a sort of sympathy, a sort of tragic sympathy that you go, oh, look at these downtrodden goblins. Let's try and raise them up in the world. Let's try and help out these poor, because goblins are people too, and the poor are people too. So that's the message I try and convey with the goblins, but inevitably the players are always like, oh, goblins, I stomp you and I smash you under my boot heel, stupid goblin. So it doesn't always quite work out. But these Western goblins, they're very clever individuals. They're dexterous, both of fingers, and they're dexterous of their mind. And they have a special penchant for this budding industry of technology. And so when there are factories or people are making iron golems to patrol the streets or to do manual labor, or they are perhaps airship and dirigible mechanics getting these magical gears working. They're expert clockmakers and things like that. Goblins are not, it's not strange in my settings to see goblins or orcs or ogres in a city. They're not creatures that live out in tribes in the wild. Well, they certainly do that. They're not only relegated to living out in the wilds and living in tribes. So a goblin in the city is not a strange sight. And so these goblins were often mechanics, and they're often technical laborers. And it was a hard knock life for the goblins because the goblins had a very strange resistance to magical radiation. And that was the pollution in my game, is any sort of magitech, device, because it's powered by these magical crystals. They give off this radiation, and that will cause pollution, and that will cause mutation. That's where the certain horrendous mutations like aboleths and gricks and other sort of mutated creatures, that's where they came from in my campaign. Oh, the digester, that's a horrendous mutation that comes from a clockwork device. And so the goblins were bizarrely almost immune to this magical radiation, and so they were often given the worst jobs of going into the sewers and getting the plumbing working again, as horrific monsters like carrion crawlers were just going out, 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 just gobbling them up. So that was the hard knock life of the goblin in the West and in the cities. Now, the Eastern goblins, they had a tough life, but it was a bit better than the Western goblins. Now, the Eastern goblins, instead of having a long nose and green skin, they have pug noses, and they're like yellowish to orangish like a hobgoblin. And the point of that was that the Hobgoblin Empire in the East, they're sort of in the Middle East, like the Persia sort of region, and it was the Empire of Dalam is what it was called. And the goblins, the Eastern goblins, were the slave caste of the hobgoblins, also subjugated. But a certain amount of the Eastern goblins who were clever enough to prove their worth were employed as master alchemists and creature tamers and creature breeders and creature creators. Instead of being magnificent with technology like the other goblins, the Eastern goblins were geniuses at alchemy. And so they were constantly making the potions. The best potions came from goblin alchemists from the East along those trade routes. But these goblin alchemists, they also made beasts of war so that the hobgoblins could use them in their attacks. And it was the Hobgoblin Empire. They were constantly expanding. And so these goblin alchemists, they made the chimeras, they made the manticores, and they made the displacer beasts. And they made the pegasi. Any sort of animal that was the combination of a few other animals, that was the creation of goblin alchemists and their monster breeding and experimentations with alchemy. So that is the Eastern goblins, and those are the Western goblins, and that is what they did in my world. So question 11. What was the last non-RPG thing you saw that you converted into game material? Now, the last thing I did, and it's probably because I'm doing this all the time, is using cinematic techniques in my games. And this is, flashbacks, this is cutscenes, this is cutaways, and this is vignettes of different things that are going on throughout time. I like to use cinematic techniques in my games, and especially when using cutscenes. It's a short scene about other characters who are somewhat NPCs who are not in the party, other characters, and I like to tease at a plot that the Thieves Guild might be concocting, or I like to tease at a strange deal that maybe some Eastern goblins are doing, giving potions out on the street. It takes a mature player to accept these cutscenes and go like, ooh, that is tantalizing to me out of character because I have this knowledge. But my character does not have the knowledge of these shady deals that these goblins are doing. So I'm sure your group is mature enough to handle this. So try putting in some, character flashbacks for the characters themselves. Like, maybe do a scene about, hey, someone's playing a fighter. Maybe do a scene with them, something quick. So you don't bore the other players. But do a scene of like, yeah, what was it like in the Fighters Academy? What was it like that first time that you picked up your sword in the practice square? Did you find that you were, I'm a natural combatant and I'm just whooping everyone's ass? Or did you just get beat down into the dust and you swore to yourself that you would never be defeated again? So these are the sorts of things that I like to slip into the game here and there. Now, question 12. What's the funniest table moment you can remember right now? I'm just going to use a recent thing. This was also in the Westeros campaign. So our group goes to an inn, and I forget how much it costs, but the innkeeper gives us this fairly high cost for staying at the inn. And my brother, who's playing a maester, is just sort of this wise man, this learned man, this doctor, this medieval doctor. He hears the price and goes, "What? I can almost buy a dog for that." Now, the reason it was funny is because all of us characters, when we created our characters unbeknownst to each other, for some reason, every single one of us bought at least one hunting dog as a companion. My character had two, named Grip and Fang. And so it just, and as we unveiled our characters, we realized, man, we got like 18 dogs following us around. And so we sort of, after the maester was like, every price that he saw, he was like, okay, how many dogs is that worth? Or how many sections of a dog is this worth? So the joke, the sort of out-of-character joke became that our house, being in the north and being weirdos, we had a dog-based economy. And so I was like, oh, I'll give you 3 dogs and a puppy for this bale of grain. I don't know. It was funny to me. Hopefully it's sort of funny to you. Dog-based economy. So, question 13. What was the last game book you looked at, and why were you looking at it? I had to take a look at the Savage Worlds Fantasy Companion, one that I've reviewed previously, and I wanted to check on the stats for Frost Giant. And the reason I was doing this, I was checking, does the Frost Giant have enough stats to fight a beginning superhero from the Savage Worlds superhero setting? And the reason I was looking at this was because I have this idea for a campaign, and it's sort of a mashup of the apocalypse and superheroes, and the apocalypse with like a Ragnarok feel, and survival horror. The idea that I have gleaned from some series of video games being Infamous, in which a horrible disaster strikes this fictional New York City, and from this horrible disaster, a few individuals, your character included, gain superpowers. And it's like, oh, what do you do in this situation? And the game gives you the choice of becoming a superhero or a supervillain. And it was also inspired by the Devil Survivor series of RPGs. And in that one, a magical apocalypse is threatening Japan. And you have a group of characters, and they are given powers. And you choose like how do you approach this apocalypse? How do you stop it? And you're told in the beginning of the game, the world will end in 7 days. Do with your time what you will. And you go through, and you can't choose to do all quests, and you can't choose to pursue building relationships with all characters because you're under this time constraint. So that was cool. And also the video game Batman Arkham City, which is a superhero game in a ruined city during the dead of winter. So I was taking all these ideas, and I want to have this sort of Ragnarok is actually happening and it sort of closes off Manhattan. The characters are, as this magical apocalypse happens, the player characters, amongst many other NPCs, are suddenly infused with supernatural powers. They essentially become superheroes. And so they're choosing how will they face this coming apocalypse. Can they stop it? How do they stop it? What do they do? And it would also be a combination of some survival horror, because here you are in an apocalypse occurring in the Fimbulvinter, the worst winter that has ever been recorded in New York history. And sure, you're a superhero, you can just punch through a wall, but if you don't eat, if you don't drink, and if you freeze to death in the snow, what good are your powers? And being the fact that the player characters would be these superpowered individuals, what do they do with the teeming masses of regular humanity as they are preyed upon by frost giants and other creatures, other supernatural creatures, and as they try and gather resources, will the characters help them, or will they use their massive strength to take resources from the regular people? So that's sort of a shorter campaign that I would like to run someday. So, question 14. Who's your idea of the perfect RPG illustrator? Some props for this one. I consider Gerald Brom to be one of my favorite RPG illustrators, and got some here. Some of that from Deadlands, and he illustrated the covers for most of the, well, I think he illustrated the covers for all of the Dark Sun books. And so that is who I consider to be my favorite RPG illustrator. Now, question 15. Does your game ever make your players genuinely afraid? Yeah, probably a bit. I've certainly made the players be afraid for their characters. Worried that, oh man, my character is in a bad situation, he's going to die. And that sort of nervousness, that sort of tension that is out of character, starts to flood in character, and they feel the terror of this situation. They feel the danger, and they genuinely are afraid for their safety and afraid for their lives. But I do what I can to also make the players themselves a bit scared, and I do this by I observe my friends and my family, and I catalog their fears so that I may use them against them at a later date. Now, this may be the markings of a sociopath, but it's also the markings of a good GM. Because if you know that a friend of yours is violently arachnophobic, when you're playing Vampire the Masquerade, and you need to convey the fact that in that setting, vampires are wildly afraid of fire. It's so primal, it's so ingrained in them that they're so afraid of fire. So, when I'm describing this vampire character, he sees some hobos around like a barrel that's on fire, and they're warming their hands, and he's like, oh, I want to bite these guys and take their blood. I'm really low. But I'm describing it like, imagine that this barrel filled with fire is so frightening to you, it may as well just be filled with writhing spiders at all times. And it's just like, ooh, humans aren't really afraid of fire, but when you describe it as spiders like that to an arachnophobe, they're like, oh, now I understand. That is a very scary barrel. And so, question 16, what was the best time you ever had running an adventure you didn't write? I've done that twice. Now, one of the times, where's my cup, was this. This is a beginning adventure that came with the Dark Sun setting. And I find that running these beginning games, and also I ran the beginning adventure that is in the back of the D&D 4th edition book. And I found that I got the most use out of these when I was teaching the rules and teaching the setting to new players. Either players who were new, with 4th edition, they were new to the system. And when I'm teaching, when I was teaching this Dark Sun game, sometimes it was to people who are new to D&D just in general, and they were also new to the setting. So I find that those beginning sort of tutorial missions, like tutorial that you find in a video game, but this sort of thing is actually quite useful for helping out new players. So that is when I had fun with pre-made and pre-written adventures. Question 17, what would be the ideal physical setup to run a game in? And that is, of course, the Matrix, because there you can summon up anything, and instead of describing something, it would just go and appear. Or maybe the Star Trek holodeck. That would be the ideal setup to run any RPG, where you can just sort of summon up any sort of construct, and you can see it. But that might be aiming a bit high. So the other ideal physical setup would be in a castle hall, and it is lit by torches lining the walls, and you're on a great oaken table that is as ancient as the castle itself. And upon this oaken table, painted on the wood, is the world map for whatever sort of campaign that you're running. That would be the ideal physical setup. So question 18, if you had to think of the most disparate game products you like, what would they be? That would be two things. JRPGs and the Dungeon Master's Guide, any sort of GM's guide, actually. Now, the reason that these are two of the most disparate things is that in a video game RPG, that is the game is telling you what is up. The graphics replace the description of the environment. The game can only give you whatever sort of story that the game already has programmed in. It can only give you the characters that are already programmed into the game. So you know, you're playing the game, you're going through that story, but it can't change that much. You know, there's only so much that you can put into a game currently, and so you experience it, and it's got the cool graphics, and it's got, you know, the fun story, and it's got these colorful characters, but you can only have that which is already set upon the plate. So this right here is the remake of Final Fantasy III, and that's the game where I got my handle of Onion Kid from. That is a character class in Final Fantasy III is called the Onion Kid. It's weird. So that is juxtaposed with the any sort of GM's guide, because that is when you are creating the setting. That is when you are creating the description, and that is when you are setting up the world and all the characters instead of having them given to you. I think both have merit. You know, it's fun to create. It's fun to bring about this world. It's also fun to play through a world that is set up for you, and you're exploring it yourself. And you know, you're having the fun experience of being a player in someone else's world. So, if you had to think of the most disparate influences overall in your game, what would they be? This is question 19. And I think those two things would be personal experiences that I've had. So that's internal. That's like, you know, when I've done like hiking trips and camping trips in like desert and forest and things like that. So, you know, it's like, oh, I know that I know thirst, and I know heat of the desert. I know the sounds of the forest. I know that when night falls, it falls hard, and it's, you know, completely pitch black in the forest. So I can bring these things into a game. You know, I can talk about how frigid it is, even in the desert. You know, how frigid it is in the desert at night, and then, you know, the only warmth that you have, is right in front of the fire. You know, juxtaposed with the day where it's just beating down on you. So the two things would be personal experiences, and then the cinema, you know, the sort of media that I've consumed as a person, and that is external. And you know, I see movies, and I learn techniques, I learn story techniques, I learn, oh, that's cool, that's a cool thing in a movie, I want to bring that into a story. Or like, oh, that was a cool scene, I want to recreate that, you know, differently, but I want to recreate it somewhat in you know, in my game. I want to bring that to the forefront. So those are the two disparate influences in my gaming. And so question 20. As a GM, what kind of players do you want at your table? Well, the answer to that is, of course, Gina Torres, Zoe Saldana, and Rosario Dawson. We all have a type. Can you guess what my type is? That's right. Actresses who have been in action comedies. Now, I think everyone's response to this question is probably the same, and that is, I would like intelligent and creative players. Also respectful players, and if you could have another adjective, sexy players. But if you combine all those things together, there's only one person you can game with, and that is Brady McPenguin. So it limits your audience somewhat. Now, question 21. What real-life experiences have you translated into game terms? Well, this sort of harkens back to my story about Brant the Bastard, the Westeros character that I was playing. And it is someone in a drunken confession of a dark past or a traumatic past. You know, I've been told some stories from combat veterans. I'm just like, oh man, I can barely even wrap my head around it. And so, hearing those things, learning those things, and seeing how it affects a person, I've brought that into the stories that I try and tell during games, and try and give that some respect, you know, and some realism, and bring that in. So, question 22, is there an RPG product you wish existed but doesn't? Yes, and that is, I wish that there was a supplement for the Warhammer 40,000 series of RPGs. I wish there was a supplement for playing as orcs. Now, if you're unfamiliar, the Warhammer 40,000 orcs, imagine all the road warriors from the Mad Max movies, and but then turn them into orcs, and give them the ability to travel through space. So you have these, you know, these rowdy, you know, crazies who are, you know, riding around on their buggies and their dirt bikes, and they're shooting weapons at each other. But they also have the ability to create spacecraft, so they can do this throughout the entire galaxy. And also, these orcs, while dim in the brain, are also they're genetically manipulated by this ancient race. I won't get into it, but they have ingrained in their DNA, some of them have the ability to create all sorts of crazy like scientific devices, and this allows them to make their ships. It allows them to create these crazy like powerful weapons, and so I think it would give you a lot of character classes to be you can have those sort of mad scientist orc. There are psychic orcs called weird boys. There's a warrior orc. You can even be a goblin sort of character and be a sneaky type. So I think playing a campaign in 40k where everyone is part of an orc clan and you're trying to become the biggest, baddest clan on this desert planet, and it's just like Road Warrior, I think that'd be really fun. So the final question, question 23, is there anyone you talk to about RPGs that doesn't play? How do those conversations go? They go very well, because all I need to do is say, me and my friends, we sit in the basement and we cast magic missile at the darkness. Then if I say that, I never have to talk to that person again. It's amazing. No, I don't really do that, actually. And there are rare times that I talk to someone about who does not play RPGs. When I talk to them about RPGs, the conversation goes well, but it typically doesn't go for long, because if someone talks to you about something that you have no interest in, or you're talking to them, why do that? So I find that when I'm explaining RPGs to someone who is not familiar with the hobby, well, I always try and frame it in the sense of that it is collaborative storytelling. It is writing, it is acting, and it is it's crafting a story amongst a bunch of people. It's not just one person, not just one director, it's not just one writer. It's everyone creating a story. I mean, it's almost like a movie production. The only difference is that you don't film it. You record it up in here in your mind. You have those memories. And so when you explain it like that, it's very easy for non-RPG types to grasp on this, because movies, that's just out there in the zeitgeist. Everyone knows about movies and film production, and everyone has an interest in movies. Well, almost everyone has an interest in movies, and so if you're going to explain it to a non-RPG player, I find that is an excellent way to go about it. So that has been the 23 questions, and this has probably been the longest video I've ever made. Alright, I'll see you later, everyone. Thanks for watching.